franchises. Gotta love them, right? The good old giving studios an excuse to rehash old ideas instead of doing something original for once in their damn lives. Really though, nothing is a more exciting time for a fandom than when a sequel to their favorite thing gets announced. Doesn't matter what you're into, games, music, Birdemic, Chess 64, just wait. Your patience and religious consumerism will reward you with another big purchase of more of the same. This gives a violent, screaming birth to franchises. Why am I explaining this to you? Video game franchises that run really long tend to build up certain expectations. Gameplay genre, story tone, length of the campaign, good. So that makes it all the more interesting when there's a singular entry that sticks out like a sore thumb. That one entry that's treated with a unique sense of care, disregard, concern. Maybe it's built up an interesting little cult following full of people with a deep-seated appreciation for it. Those kind of games are the ones that I find the most fascinating. Those miniature fandoms within fandoms are filled with some of the most passionate fans that want nothing more than to appreciate their special thing. But why does this happen in the first place? Well, from what I've observed and experienced is that the game is generally one of two things. It's either very different than the surrounding entries, whether that be the gameplay or the story, the setting, or structure, and as a result, people with certain preferences gravitate and latch on to that specific entry for its uniqueness. Either that or the fans feel as if the entry is misunderstood or underappreciated. It's human nature to want to side with the underdog after all, and when you like something only to come to realize that the rest of the world has ignored it like a street dog, or a homeless person, a lot of people are going to resonate with that feeling, and those attempts to connect with other devoted fans and spread the word of awareness or defense is going to strengthen that attachment even more. I find the outliers within the franchise tend to be my favorites because I have such a huge appreciation for wanting to break away from what came before and do something completely original. Some of the most interesting games have sprouted from this desire to reinvent and recreate what had come before. However, regardless of how ambitious or inventive something is, it's still gotta be good. Star Ocean integrity and faithlessness is commonly disregarded for a reason. While far from a disaster, it does not live up to the other Star Ocean games, and that is made all the more apparent by the Divine Force. But if the game is good, arguably better than other games in the franchise, it shouldn't matter if it's weird or different. It should be appreciated for its quality, right? Oh, sweet summer child, your words bask in a warm glow of youthful ignorance. How it speaks to a desirable bliss, one which lives in our minds, yet remains forever in unobtainable memory. No. It doesn't work like that. So today we're going to be looking at some franchise outliers that I find to be interesting and trying to figure out why they're misunderstood or underappreciated. Are these games worthy of the cult status? Well, I hope I piss everyone off. It's kind of odd to talk about a game that is so universally critically acclaimed in this context. In fact, it's one of the most universally critically acclaimed games. Well, hey, repetition in writing makes me horny! Skyward Sword found itself in a very weird spot upon launch, a game that was compared to the crown jewel of the franchise when it came to quality, yet also found itself in a baker's dozen pounds of criticism by certain sects of the fanbase. Skyward Sword is a very different 3D Zelda. Its world is more concise than previous entries. It has no interconnected areas and required motion controls for a lot of actions, which kinda made the game suffer as a result. Zelda is a franchise that is commonly tied to innovation, pushing the industry forward. Even games like Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, which followed already established formulas, sported large worlds and impressive spectacle. Skyward Sword pulls back its scope in a lot of ways, which makes the backlash kind of understandable. Did anyone expect the sequel to the long-awaited realistic Zelda to be a less realistic, motion-controlled linear adventure through smaller areas, less dungeons, all tied together with an annoying level of tutorialization and pace killers? Maybe it did. All I know is that I was 8. I've noticed that a lot of the changes made to the core formula were responses to critiques made towards Twilight Princess. Some people see TP as a fairly derivative title as it shares so much DNA with Ocarina of Time. Its world is really big, yes, but it's not dense, nor is it laid out in a notably interesting manner. Don't get me wrong, I adore Twilight Princess with my heart of hearts. It's the apple of my eye, the straw in my proverbial ham. I'd give my son away for it. You know, my proverbial son. Skyward Sword is a smaller game, yes, but it's an extremely densely packed one. An approach I personally greatly prefer. The trips between dungeons feel like dungeons in and of themselves. The puzzle solving never stops, and more so than any other 3D Zelda provides a consistently intelligent and engaging experience. And while the motion controls are used in a lot of stupid ways, like the bird flying, the actual sword play makes every enemy encounter into something you have to think about. The core combat is arguably the franchise peak. But despite my love for the combat and the story, in the game. I do understand the animosity towards it when compared to other mainline 3D Zeldas. It's one of the only games in the lineage that made the conscious choice to be a shimmy sideways instead of a clear step forward. While it did indeed fix a lot of problems within the franchise and gifted a ton of Breath of the Wild's greatest ideas on a silver platter, it did so by ditching some of the staple philosophies people really liked. Hence, a little shimmy to the left. Majora's Mask was also more of a step sideways than a full leap forward, but it didn't ditch what people liked about Ocarina of Time, it just put a really weird spin in its ideas. Skyward Sword is a wonderful game, and I'd argue it's one of the best in the franchise, but its unique approach to progression and level design alongside its controversial motion controls highlight exactly why some people would scrutinize it under an electron microscope, and others would take it to their graves. Oh, what a weird game this one is. What I'm about to say kind of goes against the point of this video, but I feel like there are multiple Fire Emblem games you could argue belong on this list. Fates for its complete absurdity, Thracia 776 for bending players over its knee and spanking their organs out through their mouths. I mean, I've never played that one, but based on that description, it sounds like I'd love it. Radiant Dawn is a weird game in retrospect, because it doesn't really do a ton wrong, it just absolutely wasn't what the series needed, like, at all. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn is a sequel to Path of Radiance on the GameCube, featuring pretty much the entire cast and then some. It portrays a war story from multiple different perspectives and fleshes out a lot of what was left untouched in its predecessor. It was also notable as the worst-selling entry in the franchise on what was then their most popular home console, putting the future of the franchise on a real tight rope. At least when Path of Radiance sold less than previous entries, it had the excuse of being on a console where the closest strategy RPG competition was Billy Hatcher. Not a lot of people own that thing, and RPGs weren't its forte. For the longest time, Nintendo considered Fire Emblem to be too smart for the overseas audience, and the games we actually got were a lot of times dampened experiences when compared to their Japanese counterparts. Each game went out of its way to teach players the ins and outs of Fire Emblem as well, Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade being the most notable with a comprehensive 10-chapter tutorial arc. Now don't get me wrong, this is not me complaining, that was absolutely the right move to make. After all, Fire Emblem 7 and 9 were the first games we got on handheld and home consoles respectively. They made sure that the player knew what was up. Radiant Dawn was never a Fire Emblem game for beginners, which makes sense, right? It's a sequel, so to some extent it expects you to have knowledge of the franchise in your head before diving in. That's not the biggest sin in the world, but there was one teensy-weensy little issue. This game is hard. Like, harder than most. And when translating the game from Japanese to English, they translated the difficulties from normal, hard, and very hard to easy, normal, and hard. Meaning our comparatively virgin non-Japanese brains were unknowingly playing hard mode. This game fucked people up. The reviews were not kind in a lot of cases, harping on the lack of ambition within the presentation and overall being an extremely punishing experience. So it was a Fire Emblem game, really. But the sales of the franchise were beginning to reveal that the classic Fire Emblem formula needed a real kick to the knockers, so they revamped the presentation and writing for Fire Emblem Awakening into the sworn enemy of every casual sex enjoyer. Say it with me now, everybody! Anime! I never liked the direction Awakening took. Don't get me wrong, I like anime, and it's not like the older games didn't dabble in the culture. Fates was not the first game to prominently feature incest after all, but the paper-thin character writing, contained length, and less ambitious storytelling all replaced what Radiant Dawn had ushered in, which was a huge, challenging, sprawling war story. I get why people didn't buy into it because of its high bar of entrance and little intent to ease players in, but for someone who does know their way around the Fire Emblem franchise, Radiant Dawn's one of the best. Tales of Berseria is an incredibly bizarre game that I've never for the life of me been able to fully wrap my head around. For a franchise that is known for its very stereotypical anime everything, I always found it very strange that for precisely one mainline title they radically shifted the tone to something much darker and just weird. Like, most entries have you exploring picture book fantasy world with some kind of unique twist. Fantasy world, but slavery. Fantasy world, but fortune-telling rocks float around in the atmosphere. Fantasy world, but slavery. Berseria is a comparatively gloomy game with a cast that is far less, well, stereotypically anime. Bloodthirsty woman, cursed swordmaster, legendary pirate who's name dropped in previous games, criminal. However, despite the cast kinda sorta being the villains of the story realistically, they're no less cliched than previous games. Most of the playable cast feel unique in concept, but realistically aren't much more than your stereotypical anime fare. Cursed Swordmaster, who's fueled by revenge, a fine and edgy little inclusion, but I've seen it before. We still have a cutesy mascot character and the required child, which is in every Tales of game. I imagine at this point is one of the first things they check off the list. And of course, our rare female lead is drop-dead gorgeous, unsurprisingly also hell-bent on revenge. A woman that could kill me. Why did I expect anything else? I mean, why would I want anything else? Velvet could step on me and I'd apologize for being too hard. So we have this blend of a serious tone and witty dialogue, a world which has a lot of grimier issues on display, but this bitch sticking out like a sore thumb and kind of making me not want to play it or wear clothes. In my opinion, this has always reeked of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, trying something new, but in actuality being too scared to really go all in on the serious storytelling. Velvet's quest for revenge is something that is supposed to be taken very seriously, but the dialogue is so campy and a lot of times devoid of subtlety that I find it really hard to go along with it. But my lord, people really loved this game, didn't they? Tales of Zestiria felt really stale to a lot of people, and as the first game on a modern console, people expected to have the franchise pushed way further forward. I mean, the game was developed for the PS3, so I don't really know what they expected. However, there were a lot of complaints aimed towards its clunky gameplay and story, so I guess the criticisms were valid. I guess in Berseria's case, people were just relieved to see the franchise at least try something a little different. And it resonated with a lot of people, so in the end, that's a win. It's far from my favorite Tales game. I've never managed to really jive with much of anything in it, but I'll also be the first to admit that I've never beaten the campaign. But at the same time, I haven't finished history either. I know the War of 1812 ain't no Tower of Babylon or Martin von Buren. I'll definitely give it a full playthrough one of these days because I do have an undeniable appreciation for it. I mean, how could I not, really? These are the legs that I want to kill me. So last year, I made a pretty simple Xenoblade 3 wishlist video, but outside of that, I've yet to speak on the franchise at length because the prospect of doing so just scares the jiggles out of my wiggles. No pun intended. No pun present. These games mean a lot to me. Shulk is my favorite video game character ever, and Xenoblade 2 is in my top 5 titles of all time. But to really digest everything a Xenoblade game has to offer, you gotta dedicate at least 100 hours. And considering that most games on the Wii U have been ported to other consoles, escaping the soon-to-be defunct eShop and 15 units sold, 14 to this absolute madman, I think it's safe to say that Xenoblade Chronicles X is unarguably and probably forever will be the franchise black sheep. I see it every day when I'm out and about. A completely average trip to the store to buy my weekly dozen loaves of bread whispers the words of the confused into my ears. Hark! An aisle over. What even is Xenoblade X, they ask? Why is it so extremely different when compared to other titles within the franchise, and why does Monolith seem to have no interest in porting a game so many people want to play for the first time and re-experience after years of being stuck on an irrelevant platform? I live in a really weird town. Alright, let's be real. What was this? Xenoblade Chronicles X is technically the second title in the Xenoblade franchise, and it's the only one that doesn't exist within the same canon. While the numbered titles are all firmly planted in the same garden, sharing a fascinating history and growing lore, Xenoblade X did its own thing in pretty much every regard. If the combat wasn't reminiscent of its older brother, then what would tie these games together? I'll tell you what. Satan! Xenoblade X is loved by a lot of people, and you'll never hear the end of the song singing its praises. And for good reason. X is a great game and feels wholly distinct from other entries, while still maintaining all of the gameplay philosophies the original title was known for. It has an open world, but this time it's seamless and absolutely monstrous. It has MMO-inspired combat, but sports a ton of party members and classes to dick around with. I mean, that point is kinda made moot by Xenoblade 3, but I mean, more than half of a decade of uniqueness is enough, right? The soul of the Xenoblade gameplay loop is still intact within X. However, the biggest controversial aspect to this adventure is the lack of emphasis on its storytelling, which confused a ton of people. Xenoblade 1's story is nearly unrivaled, so when all we got was a spiritual successor with a heavily de-emphasized plot, people were naturally concerned. I've never beaten Xenoblade X, but I played more than half of its campaign, and it really didn't feel like much happened. The emphasis is on the gameplay, which undeniably flourishes. A super powerful campaign is not what every game needs. Breath of the Wild is a pretty de-emphasized story, and it's the best game ever made, pretty much solely off of the emotions it can make you feel in every other aspect. But the confusion, and in some cases distaste for X, is understandable, because for a while it seemed like this is all we were gonna get. One title with a godly story and gameplay, and one title with godly gameplay, and a sexy alien. rebellion. Oh god, were we unprepared. But now that we know the future for the franchise is bright and far more in line with initial expectations, it is a lot easier to appreciate X for what it is, and honestly, it does a lot of stuff better than the mainline titles. The world design really is just so good. But until it gets a re-release, it absolutely deserves cult status, because it really can't physically be anything else. But according to the devs, porting it would be a very difficult affair, so hold on to your Wii U's, everybody. He's coming for it. Alright, you know what? If you want to know the worst way to handle a franchise, make a big budget JRPG with a shit ton of industry legends, and follow it up with 2 DS sequels in 2 completely different, unrelated gameplay genres. Blue Dragon, baby! A fairly successful modernization of a classic turn-based RPG. You know, for 2008, it was the first title by Mistwalker Studios, who would go on to make the world-renowned mobile title Party Wave. When it came to making a successor to Blue Dragon, they opted for the DS, which is a strange choice, but I can go along with it. What I find more confusing than anything else, though, is that instead of running with the established formula, something that could have, in all honesty, worked with some minor tweaks,
they didn't just change course, oh no, they derailed the whole train. Oh, come on, Mistwalker!
Blue Dragon Plus is a terrible name for a sequel, because that's what this is. Different genre, simpler platform, but a proper sequel to the story of Blue Dragon, which is indeed something I can respect. And this title is by no means a bad one. Blue Dragon Plus is a pretty cool little strategy game. It's just a very unfortunate way to handle a franchise that in a different timeline definitely became something really big. I can only assume the decision to follow up an Xbox 360 game with something the size of its third pinky digit was a money thing, and it's not like these games lack care as a result. Both sequels have distinct personalities and reasons to exist. Blue Dragon Plus in particular really does feel like a vision was there. Tons of characters, a cool blend between Blue Dragon's ideas and real-time strategy. Really creepy looking character portraits. What the hell was that? I wish I was in the know when these games were announced so I could have experienced the discourse among fans, because they must have just been so confused. These games aren't cash grabs, they're good games and justify themselves, but I remember a similar thing happening with Fire Emblem Warriors, 3 Hopes, and Age of Calamity. Furthering a beloved story through a new gameplay loop that absolutely didn't appeal to most of the fans. I mean, the games sold great because Nintendo fans are shameless shills. I would know because I am one. I have an unopened copy of Bravely Default 2, bought Scarlet just to play it once, and Splatoon 3 out of FOMO. I am the disease. Maybe they knew their DS outing would never rival the original title, so they decided to do something completely unique, and if that's the case, I actually really respect that. Do what you can, and when you can't do what you did, don't. Do new. VD Plus and the third entry, Awakened Shadow, will forever live in the of their predecessor, because they never even had a chance to stand alongside the original 360 entry. They're strong on their own merits, no doubt, but they're not essential reading per se. Some games have sequels that demand your attention because of how much they complement the original, but this is not one of those cases. They definitely have fans and merit, but they will never escape cult status. They were doomed to that rather rose-tinted fate from the beginning. Talking about them does kind of make me want to play all 3 of them again, though. I love franchises. I love giving people money. Seeing a creator's passion be successful enough to warrant more is heartwarming, even in the most corporate of situations. And I love the groups of fans that sprout out of the natural human variability, opinions, you dig?
Don't tell Twitter I said the word!
Sometimes I sit back and think, while it can definitely be frustrating when a thing you like doesn't take off or see the spotlight in the way you feel it deserves, sometimes it's better off that way. If Star Ocean or Ni no Kuni or really any AA franchise was the biggest thing since He Who Shall Not Be Named it did the big old bad, then it wouldn't be Star Ocean or Dr. Pepper or me! They would undoubtedly lose some of the charm through the fame, evolve into something that isn't what we love. If everything was the biggest thing ever, then nothing will be anything and nothing will be sacred, alright? So I'm fine leaving the things I love in cult status in the form of a black sheep. It's fun to sing Mario and Luigi Partners in Time's praises, because I've never played it, but who's gonna stand there with a dignified straight face and say that they have? You know, I actually cut the Partners in Time segment out of this video. No free shoutouts on my channel. No sir. Yeah, I see you back there, Mario and Luigi Partners in Time fans. All 3 of you. I'm bringing down the hammer. We got beef. Say what you want, huh? Come on, say it to my face. Come over here. Closer. So I can kiss you.